Okay, so I want you to picture a crime scene.
Okay.
But this isn't a fresh one, with the yellow tape and the flashing police lights. It's the ultimate cold case.
A very cold case.
Yeah, 2,000 years cold. We're talking about an event that happened in this dusty little corner of the Roman Empire, and the subject of our investigation is this man who, frankly, never traveled more than a few hundred miles from his hometown.
He never wrote a book.
Exactly, never wrote a book, never held any kind of political office, and he died a pretty horrific criminal's death.
And yet, here we are.
Here we are, 2 millennia later, still arguing about him. So the question on the docket today for this deep dive is arguably the single most controversial question in human history.
Was Jesus of Nazareth actually who he claimed to be?
Right? Or was he just a legend, a liar, or, a lunatic?
It really is the question that everything else hinges on, isn't it?
Yeah.
And for you listening today, we aren't looking at this through the lens of blind faith or religious tradition.
No, not at all.
We are looking at it strictly through the lens of evidence. We have a massive stack of sources here to unpack.
Yeah, we've got interviews with historians, psychologists, former skeptics.
And our mission is to treat this exact material like a criminal investigation. We're stripping away the stained glass, so to speak, and just looking at the raw data.
I love that. And to do that, we're actually borrowing a methodology from the FBI. We are going to be profilers today.
Like John Douglas?
Yes, exactly. If you're familiar with the work of John Douglas, the guy who basically invented modern criminal profiling, the guy who inspired the show Mindhunter.
The absolute pioneer of behavioral science.
Right. Well, the Douglas famously said, behavior reflects personality. He argued that you could look at a crime scene, just the debris, the patterns, the specific choices that were made, and from that, you could deduce the perpetrator's psyche.
Their habits, maybe their age, their background.
All without ever actually meeting them. So the goal for our deep dive is to apply that exact same forensic rigor to Jesus. We're going to look at his behavior, his relationships, and his psychological makeup to build a reliable profile.
And to keep this organized, we've structured the investigation into 4 distinct categories of evidence.
Let's lay out the roadmap.
Okay, first up is the identity evidence. Basically, did Jesus actually think he was God, or is that just a legend invented by the church way later on?
Right.
Second is the psychological evidence. If he did think he was God, was he mentally stable? Or was he suffering from, severe delusions of grandeur?
And then third, we have the profile evidence. Does he actually match the attributes of the Almighty found in the ancient texts, or are there discrepancies in the sketch?
And finally, the fingerprint evidence. Do the ancient prophecies about the Messiah actually fit him, or is it just one giant statistical coincidence?
It's a full forensic workup.
It is.
And logically, we have to start with that first one, the identity evidence.
Right. And for this section, we relied heavily on the work of Dr. Ben Witherington III. He's a leading historian on the New Testament.
And he tackles the most common objection right out of the gate, which, I know I've heard this before. If Jesus really was God, why didn't he just say so?
Yeah, the demand for a clear, explicit quote.
Right. Why isn't there a verse where Jesus just walks into Jerusalem, finds a soapbox, stands on it, and shouts, "Hello, everyone, I am God"?
It's a totally fair question. If you're the creator of the universe, you'd think you would lead with that.
It seems like the most important piece of information you could possibly convey. So why all the secrecy?
Well, Witherington argues that it wasn't secrecy just for the sake of being mysterious. It was calculation for the sake of survival.
Survival?
Yeah. You really have to understand the mental map of a first-century Jew.
Yes.
They were fiercely monotheistic. To them, the word God meant Yahweh.
The Father.
Exactly, the burning bush, the voice on the mountain. They did not have any concept of the Trinity yet. That theology hadn't been developed.
Ah, okay. So if a human being standing right in front of them said, "I am God," they wouldn't hear, "Oh, I am the second person of the Trinity."
Not at all. They would hear, "I am Yahweh the Father," which to them would sound like pure insanity and absolute blasphemy.
Because Yahweh is a spirit, not a guy in sandals.
Right. Witherington points out that if Jesus had used those explicit words early in his ministry, he would have been stoned to death immediately.
End of story.
His mission would have ended before it even really began. Or, just as bad, the Romans would have pigeon-holed him as a political revolutionary and crushed him instantly.
So he had to sort of show rather than tell. He had to completely redefine what the word Messiah meant from the inside out before he could actually claim the title.
Precisely. And Witherington calls this implicit Christology. It's all about what he did. Look at his relationship with the disciples, for example.
Okay.
He gathers 12 of them. Now, any Jewish person back in that day knew the symbolism of the number 12.
Sure, it represents the 12 tribes of Israel. It's a symbol of the nation.
Right. But notice where Jesus positions himself. He isn't one of the 12. He isn't a member of the tribe.
Oh, that's interesting.
He is the one forming the group. He is literally standing in the position of God who formed the original tribes. He's the architect, not the building material.
That is a subtle but massive power move.
It really is.
And the sources also mention his relationship with John the Baptist, because Jesus calls John the greatest man born of women, which is incredible praise.
It is high praise. But then look at what Jesus does next. He acts as someone who is greater than John.
Right. He performs miracles. He ushers in the kingdom.
Exactly.
Right.
So logically, think about it. If John is the absolute peak of humanity, and Jesus is looking down at John from a position of higher authority.
Then what category does that put Jesus in?
A category of one.
Yeah. But let's look at how he handled the religious law, too. Because in the source material, this seemed like the absolute most dangerous thing he did.
Oh, without a doubt.
He didn't just teach the Torah, he edited it.
This is a crucial piece of the profile. In the Old Testament, the law is the direct, unalterable word of God. You simply do not mess with it.
Oh.
But Jesus gets up and says things like, "You have heard it said, but I say to you."
Yeah, he's not quoting another rabbi.
No, and he's not even saying, "Thus says the Lord," the way the old prophets did.
Right, because the prophets were basically like messengers delivering a telegram. They're standing there saying, hey, don't shoot the messenger. This is a message from the boss.
Exactly. But Jesus speaks as if he is the boss. He unilaterally amends the laws on purity, for instance, declaring all foods clean.
Wow.
Witherington argues that to a first-century Jewish audience, the only person with the authority to amend the law of God is God himself. He is actively placing his own authority above the scriptures.
And he also forgave sins.
Yes.
And not just sins against him personally, because this is the part that I think always trips people up.
Right, and it should.
Yeah.
Look, if you punch me in the face, I can forgive you. That's an interpersonal transaction. But if you punch me, and some random stranger walks up to you and says, "I forgive you for punching him," that stranger is delusional. It makes absolutely no sense.
Unless this stranger is the one who is ultimately offended by the action.
Correct. And in the Jewish worldview, all sin, at its core, is ultimately a rebellion against God. So when Jesus goes around forgiving sins committed against third parties, he is acting as God.
Okay, so looking at the identity evidence, the profile clearly shows a man who absolutely positively thought he was divine.
Without a doubt.
But, and this leads us directly into the danger zone, that brings us to the psychological evidence.
Sanity check.
Because honestly, let's play devil's advocate for a second. If I walked into this studio today, sat down at this mic, and told you I had the authority to forgive the world's sins and that I was the architect of humanity.
I wouldn't bow down to you.
No, you'd call a psychiatrist. You'd have me locked up.
You would be 5150'd immediately. And this is exactly what C.S. Lewis called the mad, bad, or God trilemma. If he genuinely believed he was God, and he wasn't just lying to everyone, he very well might have been clinically insane.
So to analyze this part of the profile, we looked at the work of Dr. Gary Collins. He's a psychologist with decades of clinical experience.
We essentially asked him to put Jesus on the couch.
Right. So did Collins find any evidence in the historical record of mental illness? You know, paranoia, schizophrenia?
Collins says the psychological profile comes back completely clean.
Really? Completely clean?
Yes. Think about it. Delusional people, people with a literal God complex, they usually exhibit very specific, observable symptoms.
Like what?
They have inappropriate emotional responses, like laughing uncontrollably at a funeral. They're often highly paranoid, constantly thinking everyone is out to get them or plotting against them. They fundamentally lose touch with reality.
And Jesus doesn't show any of that.
He's the exact opposite. He's incredibly grounded in reality. He shows highly appropriate emotions.
Like when he weeps when his friend Lazarus dies.
Yes. And sure, he gets angry. But it's a righteous, logical anger directed at systemic corruption in the temple, not some chaotic, disjointed outburst.
Plus, he navigates all those complex social traps set by the religious leaders.
Exactly. He does it with a sharpness that suggests a very high-functioning logic. It's not indicative of a thinking disorder at all.
But okay, what about the charismatic leader theory?
Yeah.
The idea that maybe he wasn't clinically crazy, but he was just this master manipulator, like a hypnotist.
Right, Enid Wilson's theory.
Yeah. Wilson proposed that the miracles were essentially just mass hypnosis. Basically, Jesus tricked people into thinking the water was wine.
It's a very creative theory.
Yeah.
But Collins tackles that one head on, and the hypnosis theory really falls apart on the basic mechanics of how hypnosis actually works.
How so?
Well, first off, hypnosis generally requires a willing, receptive subject. You can't just hypnotize a stubborn skeptic into seeing a miracle against their will. Yet we know Jesus' own brother James was a massive skeptic who didn't believe in him until the very end. You can't hypnotize your own cynical sibling who grew up in the same house as you.
That's a great point. Also, the scale of it just seems impossible to me, like the feeding of the 5,000.
Exactly. Performing mass hypnosis on a restless crowd of that size, outdoors, with no controlled environment. From a clinical standpoint, it's technically impossible.
And hypnosis definitely doesn't explain the physical evidence left behind.
No, it doesn't. If you hypnotize a guy with a withered hand, he might temporarily think it's healed, but the hand doesn't physically, structurally grow back. The ancient texts describe immediate, permanent physiological changes.
And frankly, you certainly can't hypnotize a corpse.
No.
The resurrection, or even just the basic fact of the empty tomb, can't be explained away by the power of suggestion.
And you also can't forget the pigs.
The pigs. Oh, right, the exorcism.
The exorcism accounts, yeah. Jesus casts demons out of a man and into a herd of pigs, and the pigs literally run off a cliff. Collins makes a really funny but totally valid clinical point here. You cannot hypnotize a pig.
That's true.
Pigs do not suffer from psychosomatic disorders. If the animals reacted so violently, something objective and real actually took place in that moment.
Wow. Okay, so if he wasn't lying and the psychological profile completely rules out insanity, we are left staring at the possibility that he was actually telling the truth.
Which brings us right to the profile evidence.
The theological sketch check.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because if you are going to claim to be the God of the Bible, you need to match the very specific attributes of that God.
Omniscience, omnipresence, eternality, all the big ones.
Right. And this is where the investigation gets a bit tricky. And it's where we brought in the work of theologian Dr. D.A. Carson.
Because if you read the New Testament closely, there are definitely moments where Jesus seems, well, less than God.
Yeah, like when he explicitly says, the Father is greater than I.
Right. That sounds like a corporate hierarchy to me, like he's the vice president and the Father is the CEO. If he is God, how can God be greater than him?
It definitely sounds contradictory to our modern ears. But Carson explains that this phrase refers to his position during the Incarnation, not his underlying essence.
Okay, unpack that.
Let's use an analogy. Think of it like the President of the United States and, say, a regular private citizen.
Okay.
The president undeniably has a greater rank. He has far more authority and power in that position. But is the president more human than the private citizen?
No, of course not. They share the exact same human nature.
Exactly. Carson argues that Jesus, while he was on earth, had voluntarily set aside his divine glory. He was in a temporary, humble state.
Submitting to the Father's plan.
Right. But his nature, his actual godness, was completely identical to the Father's. He was speaking about his operational role in the mission, not his biology, so to speak.
Got it. But what about the phrase in Colossians where he is called the firstborn of all creation?
Skeptics love that one.
They do, because firstborn implies a beginning. It implies he was created by God, not that he is God.
And that is a classic translation trap. You have to look at the ancient Near East context. Back then, the term firstborn wasn't always about literal birth order.
It wasn't.
No, it was often a legal title. It meant supreme heir, or the highest-ranking official. For example, King David was called the firstborn of kings in the Psalms, even though historically he was actually the youngest of 8 brothers.
Oh, wow. So it's a designation of rank. It basically means the boss.
Correct. Context is entirely key here. The exact same author who wrote that firstborn verse also wrote a few sentences later that all the fullness of deity dwells in him.
So he clearly didn't mean Jesus was just a created being.
Clearly not.
Okay, so those are the intellectual hurdles. But Carson also addressed the emotional hurdles in the source material.
The things that make people actively dislike the profile of God.
Right. And look, just to be clear for you listening, we aren't taking sides here. We're just reporting what the source material says. But these are highly charged topics, specifically hell. If Jesus is supposed to be the embodiment of perfect love, how does the concept of hell fit into his profile? To a lot of people, it feels like a massive contradiction.
It's probably the hardest concept for modern listeners to grasp. But Carson argues that we struggle with the idea of hell primarily because we have a very low view of sin.
Meaning?
Meaning, we tend to think of sin as just making a mistake or
Yeah.
having a bad day.
Hmm.
But the biblical profile views sin as a created being looking directly at their creator and saying, I don't need you. I am the center of the
It's
universe.
basically cosmic treason.
It's total cosmic narcissism. So Carson suggests that hell isn't just some medieval torture chamber that an angry God aggressively throws people into.
What is it then?
He said it's God, finally, ultimately giving people exactly what they requested. They wanted complete autonomy and to be separated from his authority.
Okay.
Hell is simply the logical result of that total separation. Carson actually uses this profound phrase. He says the doors of hell are locked from the inside.
Meaning the people there still, even then, prefer their own autonomy over submitting to God.
Yes. They would literally rather reign in hell than serve in heaven.
Wow.
It's a very sobering thought. But it's just that God's ultimate judgment is actually a tragic form of respecting human freedom. The freedom to say no.
Which brings us to another really tough issue covered in the sources. Slavery.
Yes.
Why didn't Jesus just abolish it? If he's God, he had the authority. He could have just come down and said, 11th commandment, absolutely no owning other people.
And again, bringing in Carson's argument here, he explains that Jesus' primary mission wasn't to enact a top-down political revolution. It was about bottom-up heart transformation.
Because the entire Roman economy was built on slavery.
Exactly. If he had just overthrown the economic system of Rome by decree, it might have changed the legal statutes, but it wouldn't have changed the selfish nature of the people.
So how did he address it?
Carson argues that the gospel essentially acts like a virus injected into the social system.
A virus.
A good virus. Think about when the Apostle Paul tells Philemon to treat his runaway slave not as property, but as a beloved brother.
Right.
He is quietly destroying the very philosophical basis of slavery. You cannot own a brother. Carson argues this methodology kills the horrific institution from the inside out, which is arguably far more permanent than just issuing a political decree that people would eventually rebel against.
So based on the sources, the argument is that he truly matches the profile of deity, even when we get into the really hard, uncomfortable stuff.
He does.
Which brings us to the fourth and final category. And honestly, for me, this is the one that gave me the most pause during our research.
The fingerprint evidence.
Yeah, we're talking about prophecy.
Because this is where we transition from philosophy and theology directly into hard math. The Old Testament basically acts like an ancient fingerprint file.
Right.
It contains dozens and dozens of highly specific predictions written hundreds of years before Jesus was even born. They detail his ancestry, his exact birthplace, the manner of his betrayal, and even the very specific, gruesome way he would die.
And to walk us through this evidence, we looked at the story of Louis Lapides. And let me just say, this guy's life is an absolute movie waiting to happen.
It really is. He started out as a Jewish kid from Newark.
Right.
He eventually gets drafted into the Vietnam War, sees the absolute worst, most traumatic sides of humanity, and comes back home completely broken. He starts drifting into Eastern mysticism, gets heavily into drugs, basically just trying to find some kind of spiritual anchor.
But the one thing he specifically avoided at all costs was Jesus.
Right. Because of his background, he was taught growing up that Jesus was strictly a Gentile God.
He actually thought the New Testament was essentially a handbook on anti-Semitism.
He did. He thought the very name Jesus was just a trigger word for pogroms and Jewish persecution.
Which, to be fair, is a heartbreaking historical reality in many cases.
Absolutely. But then, while he's out in California, he meets some Christians on the Sunset Strip who challenge him. And they tell him something brilliant.
Yeah.
Don't read our book. Go read your book. Look for Jesus in the Old Testament.
And he actually takes the bait. He goes and opens up the scroll of Isaiah, specifically chapter 53.
Now, keep in mind, for context, this text was written about 700 years before Christ existed.
Right. And it explicitly describes this suffering servant. It says he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, and led like a lamb to the slaughter.
Lapides reads this passage, and his immediate reaction is that it's a trick. He genuinely thinks these Christians somehow rewrote his Bible to fit their Jesus narrative.
He was so skeptical that he actually calls his stepmother back home and asks her to send him a traditional Jewish Bible just so he can check the original text.
He opens it up, and it's completely identical. The fingerprint matched perfectly.
He realized the suffering servant wasn't a metaphor for the nation of Israel like he'd been taught in his youth, but it was pointing to a specific historical person.
But I want you thinking, and I have to ask the obvious question, could it just be a massive coincidence?
Right.
I mean, history is very long, millions of people have lived. Maybe Jesus just got incredibly lucky and happened to fit the vague description.
Well, we actually looked at the hard math on this. There was a mathematician named Peter Stoner who calculated the exact probability of any one human being fulfilling just 8 of these major prophecies by pure chance.
Just 8 of them.
Just 8. And the number he came up with is 1 in 100 million. Billion.
Those numbers are just too big for the human brain to comprehend. You have to give me the visual analogy for that.
Okay. Imagine taking the entire state of Texas.
Which is massive.
Massive. And you cover the entire state in silver dollars 2 feet deep.
An absolute ocean of silver coins.
Now, take just one of those coins, paint it red, and bury it somewhere randomly in the state.
Okay.
Then you blindfold a guy, spin him around, and tell him he can walk as far as he wants in any direction, but he only gets to reach down and pick up one single coin. The mathematical odds of that blindfolded man picking up the one red coin on his very first try are the exact same odds as one person fulfilling just 8 of those prophecies by chance.
And Jesus didn't just fulfill 8. He fulfilled dozens of them.
Exactly. It completely pushes the probability past the realm of coincidence and firmly into mathematical impossibility.
But there's one final objection we have to address here. The intentional fulfillment argument.
Oh, right. Like he orchestrated it.
Yeah. Could Jesus have just read the prophecies as a kid and then intentionally acted them out? Like, oh, I see Zechariah says the Messiah is supposed to ride into town on a donkey. Hey, guys, someone go fetch me a donkey. Couldn't he have just faked his own fingerprints?
That definitely works for a few of the minor ones, sure. But Lapides points out that the vast majority of the major prophecies were completely physically out of his control.
You certainly can't control where you're born, and the prophet Micah predicted Bethlehem.
You can't control your genetic ancestry, which had to be from the specific line of King David.
And you absolutely cannot control what your executioners do to you while you're being put to death.
Right. The Roman soldiers gambling for his clothes at the foot of the cross. That was predicted in the songs.
The exact price of his betrayal being specifically 30 pieces of silver. Predicted.
And the fact that the Romans pierced his side with a spear instead of breaking his legs, which, by the way, breaking the legs was the standard operating procedure for a Roman crucifixion.
You simply can't fake the fingerprints when you're the victim hanging on the cross.
And for Lapides, all of this was the tipping point. He realized the profile undeniably matched. And interestingly, he noted that accepting this evidence didn't just satisfy his intellectual curiosity.
He said it made him whole.
Yeah, it beautifully bridged the gap between his rich Jewish heritage and his present spiritual reality.
And that ultimately brings us all the way back to the jury room.
We've gone through the entire stack of evidence.
We have the identity evidence. Jesus clearly, demonstrably claimed to be God, completely redefining the very concept of the Messiah in the process.
We have the psychological evidence. The behavioral profile shows he wasn't crazy. The mad or bad options are clinically off the table.
We have the profile evidence. He perfectly fits the complex attributes of deity, even the really hard ones regarding judgment and authority.
And finally, we have the fingerprint evidence. He matches the ancient prophetic blueprint with absolute mathematical certainty.
It is an incredibly compelling case. It moves seamlessly from the subjective, what he thought about himself, to the purely objective, what historical facts and statistical math say.
And that's exactly where the John Douglas profiler metaphor really lands for us today.
Right. Because if you have a behavioral profile that matches the suspect, and footprints that match the suspect, and ancient fingerprints that perfectly match the suspect, eventually, as a juror, you have to actually draw a conclusion.
The evidence demands a verdict.
It does. And unlike a standard cold case sitting in some dusty file cabinet downtown, this particular case has profound implications for the juror.
For you listening, because if this evidence holds up, if Jesus truly is who he claimed to be, then he isn't just some fascinating historical figure for us to analyze on a deep dive.
He is a living authority.
Right. If the profile fits, you can't just close the case file, put it back on the shelf, and walk away unchanged. You actually have to decide how you're going to respond to him.
You have to render your verdict.
And that leaves the final decision entirely with you. If the profile fits and the fingerprints match, what does that mean for your life today?
Something to think about.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.